Have you ever met a dad that liked asking for directions? I realized not long ago that we should be very grateful to our technological inventors of this day because they came up with the greatest invention ever known to dads. It's called the GPS, Global Positioning System. At any point, we can claim we are not lost. We know where we're going because we have this great woman that we'll actually listen to in our cars now. Have you noticed that? The GPS voices are almost all female. And it solved the problem of arguments in marriage, because it used to be if Debbie and I were on a drive and I got a little bit off track, she'd be like, "You turned the wrong way," right? You're going the wrong way. You should have gone this way. And then we'd end up in this discussion, which would be fairly fervent usually. Maybe even call it an argument about, don't tell me where to go, right? And I love the GPS because the GPS, instead of saying you're going the wrong way, it's so cooperative, it just says recalculating. Right? It works with us. We can say, I'm going on an adventure, I'm going here, and wherever I go, along the way, if I go, it says, you should turn left up here. It recommends, you turn left up here in 100 meters or whatever. And then when you go past the left because you decide you want to check out that tree down the road or whatever, it says recalculating. And it helps you get there no matter what you do, right? And it never nags you, it never gets mad at you, although sometimes it gets a little frustrated when you go past too many turns. It just gets confused and says recalculating about 20 times. But it's still, you never have to have an argument with it. And it's the best thing for dads because it's the only one we're allowed to shut off, right? Yes, I said that out loud. It's Father's Day. I can get away with anything today, right? No? Uh-oh. No, I really can. It's a great invention. I realize this because it's good for marriages and it's good for guys because we get to feel like we know what we're doing. And so much of the time as men, I think we are a little bit frustrated. It's a lot like asking for directions from a local. Have you ever done that? You've been driving somewhere before we had GPSs and you finally got frustrated enough and pulled over and asked a local, how do I get back to the highway? Happened to my wife and I once. We were down in Ohio, heading from Cleveland, supposedly to Niagara Falls. We thought we knew where we were going, and the highway disappeared. I hate how that happens. It just went away. And I pulled over and asked at this store, and you get the story, right? It's, okay, well, here's what you got to do. Go about 3 kilometers down the road, and when you see where the old barn used to be, turn left. And then you go, oh, no, wait a minute. No, that won't work. They closed that entrance. And you say, well, go down here. And when you see the old one-room schoolhouse, oh, no, somebody's living there now. Anyway, it just gets confusing, right? The directions are challenging. And when I first moved to New Brunswick, I found this a big challenge because where I grew up in southern Ontario, everything's north, south, east, west. There's roads that go in a straight line, believe it or not. There are actually straight roads in this world, okay? And I came to New Brunswick, and there's no straight roads. Right? There's nothing straight, and trying to find your way through can be a real challenge. And every church I served, including this one, when I arrived, I said, okay, I'd like a list of the members. I want to get to know where they live and go visit them and do all these things. And so they'd give me the list, and they'd say, here you go. And it'd be a list of all the names of the people who belong to the church, and there was no addresses. Not an address in sight. And I said, what gives? Because in Ontario, you get the addresses. Because you need the addresses, right? But here, there's no address. And the answer was, well, we know where they live. Right? We know who they are, and we know where they live. And I think that's something that's a huge challenge for us today, to understand that as the people of God, that's no longer true. That we no longer necessarily know who they are and where they live. In fact, for most of you that grew up around here, that's true, right? You used to know all your neighbors. You could name everybody lives in every house all the way down your street. And now you're going, I'm not even sure who's next door anymore. It changes so often, right? We're getting more and more to the place where you can no longer count on knowing who's next to you. And when we have the mandate, the mission from God to share this good news about Jesus Christ, it's kind of hard to do when you don't know who they are or where they live. When you don't understand maybe where they're coming from. And the other thing I'm realizing is that more and more, even when you get to meet them, you don't like them, or you don't agree with their lifestyle, or you don't like their choices. They do things we disagree with, or maybe even that offend us. And yet this is still the same community that God gave us to share the good news with. And this is a challenge if we keep trying to do things assuming we know who they are and where they live. I've heard people say all the time, well, there's not very many kids around here anymore, and it's true that our school's gone way down, but if you follow a school bus to town, it still stops a lot, right? There's still children and young people here to be reached. There's still families moving into the community. They're coming and going constantly. And we have this mandate that I think it's important we remember the lesson that Peter learned here in Acts chapter 10. to get back to our roots and remember that we are called to reach all people. Peter had a challenge. His culture, his understanding was Jesus is for Jews. I don't know if you realize this. When we get to Acts chapter 10, it's been 7 years at this point since Jesus has returned to heaven, since he gave his disciples the mandate, go and make disciples, baptize and teach to obey, since he said to them in the book of Acts, I want you to go to all nations, starting in Jerusalem and Judea, and then go to Samaria and the ends of the earth. 7 years, and they still haven't gone beyond Jerusalem and Judea. They've stayed in their own little ghetto. Because Jews aren't allowed to talk to Gentiles. They're not allowed to spend time with the people that aren't the people of God. Not have meals with them, not even talk to them. And Peter's confronted by God and learns a very important lesson. And that's very simply that everyone is invited to hear and to share the good news about Jesus. What do you mean everyone's invited? I'm not going to take the time because the dads want to go home and have a nice meal that their families are going to give them, right? So I'm not going to take the time to read all of chapter 10, but just to summarize the story, there's 2 visions in this chapter. 2 different men with 2 different visions. First we have Cornelius, who's a Roman centurion. He's very interested, though, in God. He's been praying a lot, trying to connect with God. He's been giving to the poor and caring for the poor and trying to minister to them. And so he's praying one day, and he has a vision where he hears God speak. I don't know about you, but I'd kind of like to have that experience, to actually hear God's voice out loud. Wouldn't that be cool? Maybe some of you have. But he hears God speak, and God says to him, Cornelius, I've heard your prayers. And I'm really glad to see you care about the poor like I do. Now here's what I want you to do, Cornelius. I want you to send some men over to where this guy named Peter is and tell him to come. That's the total of vision. He doesn't say why Peter should come. For all Cornelius knows, Peter's going to show up and just bop him one for daring to talk to God. He doesn't know. But so he sends some men. And the very next day, Peter has a vision. And this is where we see a change begin to happen. Peter's praying and he's hungry. It's a great combination, right? You ever tried to pray when you're hungry? Unless you're fasting on purpose, it's usually, okay, I'll come back to this, Lord. I'm going to go get a hamburger, right? But Peter's praying and hungry, and while he's in his prayer place, he has this vision, and he sees a sheet, like a blanket, come down from heaven. And it's covered with all kinds of food, with animals and with reptiles and with birds. I don't know about you, when I hear reptiles, I don't think food, right? I usually think run, but that's me. But Peter sees this sheet come down with all these creatures on it, and hears God's voice says to him, rise, kill, and eat. Peter's hungry. Here's some food. And Peter's response is, no. This stuff's on the forbidden list. Like Debbie was talking about the Pharisees. The Jews had this list of things they could eat and they weren't allowed to eat. And what's on the blanket, he's not allowed to eat. So he thinks it's a test. And Peter does what Peter always does. He argues with God. Right? God says, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter says, no, Lord, surely not. Nothing unclean has ever passed my lips. Just think about that for a second. Anybody here can say that honestly? Right? There's a lot that unclean that's probably come out if not gone in, right? Peter claims this, and 3 times it happens. He sees the sheet come down, looks at the things. God says, Peter, kill and eat. 3 times Peter says, no, Lord. Nothing unclean or common, ordinary has ever passed my lips. Only special, holy things have passed my lips. I don't know what it is with Peter. I relate to Peter. He argues with God, and God smacks him and corrects him, right? 3 times Peter denied Jesus, right? 3 times Jesus had to restore Peter. And now 3 times again Peter's messing up. But at least he's a little bit sharper. It doesn't take 3 times to get him straight. What do we see happen? Peter says, oh, so if God says it's okay, if God says it's clean, if God says that's what we're supposed to do, then that's probably okay to do it. Peter's really smart, can you tell? God says it's okay. Must be okay. The logic there was amazing. But he makes that leap. He finally gets there. And then he listens to God a little further. And God says, here's what's going to happen. 3 men are going to show up and they're going to ask you to go with them. Go. Again, no explanation. Just like God told Cornelius, I want you to send some men to get this Peter guy, who you've never met before, but go get him. Now he tells Peter, I want you to go with 3 strange men, wherever they take you. Anybody here trust God that much when he says, I want you to go where, I'm not going to tell you where you're going, just get walking. Right? Imagine if you walked out your front door in the morning and you said, okay, God, I'm available, and you just started walking, waiting for him to tell you what direction to go. Hopefully you weren't headed for the bay, right? Peter hears the knock at the door. I mean, it's one of those moments like we see sometimes in a movie where the coincidence seems to line right up, right? Here's God say, 3 men are going to come for you. And all of a sudden, knock, knock, knock. Oh. He goes downstairs and tells the other guys in the house, it's okay, I'm going with them. This is weird, right? But these two visions lead to an awakening for Peter. Lead to a radical change in his behavior. Because he comes out and he confesses, if you're to look at verse 28, he says to them when he arrives, he gets to Cornelius' house and he says, boy, I'm glad to be here. It's wonderful to see you. No, that's not what he says. He starts out the worst sermon ever, okay? Usually a sermon, you try and get people's attention. You try and connect with them a little bit. This is how Peter starts. So the first thing he says in verse 28, you yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. In other words, I'm not supposed to be around you people. Right? And then he goes on, but God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. How many times have we made a judgment about another human being, friends? Raise your hand if you've ever made a judgment about another human being. You've judged them in a negative way. What they do, how they live, what they say, their lifestyle, whatever word you want to put on it, you disagree with, and so you make a judgment, don't you? And in making that judgment, you usually decide whether or not you will associate with them at all. Whether you'll be friends with them, whether you ever meet or visit them, whether they're just going to be one of those people you nod at going down the street. These two visions, the one for Cornelius and the one for Peter, open the door for us to see others in a different way. Peter realizes in this moment that he is prejudiced. That quite frankly, he's a bigot. That's a really harsh word, isn't it? That to make a judgment of another human being is prejudice. He was intolerant of them, and in many ways just like us. I mean, how many of us are not only proud of being Christian, of being part of God's family, but we go around looking down our nose a little bit at those that don't act like we act or think we should? Even when we're not walking the walk, when we're saying I'm a Christian but living the wrong way, we look at those other people and say, well, they shouldn't do that, and we won't be around them as long as they're like that. And the problem is, as long as we're judging them like Peter did, they don't get to hear the good news, and everyone is invited by God to hear the good news. Debbie, what a great way to retell the story of Nicodemus. This man who would seem to be an outsider, he belongs to the other party, right? And instead of being an outsider, Jesus invites him in. How much should we do the same? There should be no barriers that keep others from Jesus in us. Romans 2:11 says God hates partiality. He doesn't want us to play favorites, to judge. He wants us to invite them all in. Everyone's invited. And everyone's invited to hear the good news. We can't make them receive it, but they're invited to hear it. Folks, it's really hard for people to hear what we're saying if we start out with, I hate you. Now, some of you are saying, I'd never say that. But you do start out by saying, you really shouldn't. I don't see Jesus ever start by saying, if you smarten up, then you can come follow me. It doesn't happen. In fact, time after time, if he mentions anything about their behavior at all, it's after they've made the decision to follow him. After they've met him and chosen to go where he's going. We need a new paradigm, friends. One that lets go of judgment. We see this in verse 36. Peter says, as for the word he sent to Israel, preaching good news of peace through Jesus Christ, he is Lord of all. Everybody's heard the name of Jesus, even as a swear word. It's not like they're unfamiliar with the name. And so we need to share that good news. We need to remind them who he really is. That's what Peter does. He's in Cornelius' house. He just says, look, you need to understand who Jesus really is, what he really did. You yourselves know what happened through all Judea, beginning from Galilee after the baptism that John proclaimed. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. We need to remind people of who Jesus really was and what he spent his life doing. And we remind them not with words, but with actions. I think it was Augustine who said, preach the word. If necessary, use words. It's our actions, our behavior that tell people the truth. Do we love one another? Do we love those around us? Do we take care of the poor? Do we visit the sick? Do we let God be the judge and treat people as equals? You know what? Even if they're different from you, they're still your equal. Do you realize that? Peter didn't. Peter thought of Gentiles. Do you know what the Israelites called Gentiles? They called them pigs or dogs. Nowadays we'd say, well, that's intolerant, that's prejudiced, and we pride ourselves in not doing that. But we do. We just don't use the labels quite as obviously. The problem is that everyone needs to hear the good news. Everyone's invited to hear about his resurrection and his appearance to those who God chose to be witnesses. That's what Peter says. God raised him on the third day and made him to appear not to all the people, but to us who have been chosen by God as witnesses. You know, it's no good being a witness if you're not willing to talk about it. And there's some people that go through their lives thinking that's the pastor's job, or that's the deacon's job, or the Sunday school teacher's job. Folks, it's everyone's job. I mean, I can work all year as your pastor. Our deacons, our leaders, our Sunday school teachers, our youth workers can work all year. And if each of them reached one or two, what would we see at the end of the year? We'd be so excited about how the baptisms, but imagine if every one of us reached one. It'd probably be 10 times what we could do just letting our leaders do it. And it's about accepting them and letting them hear through us the good news. Everyone needs to hear. Everyone's invited to hear. Everyone's invited to hear and to share. Those he chose as witnesses have a task to just share what they've seen and heard. You don't have to be a theologian. You don't have to be a Bible scholar. You don't have to have an official leadership role in the church. You just need to talk about what you've seen and heard. How you've experienced God, and understand and tell people the truth that Jesus, as Peter says, is the judge. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one appointed by God to be judge of the living and the dead. What does that mean? We will all be judged by Jesus himself. We need to tell people this truth. And he goes on to say, to him all the prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. People need to hear and to share that even as Jesus is the judge, he is the answer for the problem. He is the way to forgiveness. You know, Jesus talked to the religious people of his day. He was quite firm, especially to those Pharisees Debbie was talking about. He was very strict with them, and in a passage in Matthew chapter 23, he was saying, woe is you, woe to you, woe to you. And one of the things that he say, I think really we need to hear again because it's true of us at times. The Pharisees were so busy doing the right things that they forgot the most important thing. And so he says to them, you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Don't tell me how much you pray, or how much you read the Bible, or how much you go to church, or how much you put in the offering plate, unless you can tell me how much you've shared the love of Jesus with other human beings around you. Because at the end of the day, this building and this congregation is not what it's all about. It's about Jesus and sharing him with those who need to know him. It's about us encouraging one another and loving one another that they would know we are his. That's where we need to be. That's where we need to go. Everyone is invited to hear and to share. There's no room for prejudice. I know we got a lot of great dads here. I was grateful to have a father who never taught me to be prejudiced. As far as I know, my dad is colorblind. He doesn't even see it, the differences between people. And he taught me the same thing, but I'm aware enough of myself to know that we pick up those judgments all the time. We make decisions about people. But the goal God gives us appears in Revelation in another vision when it says in chapter 7 that after this I looked, and behold, a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. Folks, there's not going to be any discrimination in heaven. It won't exist. It's not even on the radar. Because everyone who has accepted Jesus Christ will be there. So the challenge is very simple. First of all, realize that God can use anyone to reach anyone for Jesus. It's not about the pastor or the deacons. It's about each one of us doing what we can do. And just remember, when you have Jesus in common, you have everything in common. Everyone's invited to hear and to share the good news.